Hello, I would like to share with you some slides that speak to the scenic designs that I've done in the theater. These are actually from shows in two spaces. The first is from the Firehouse Theater here at Lemoyne, and also the Jesuit Theater in the Coin Performing Arts Center. One of the first considerations as I begin to develop a design is what is that actor-audience relationship? In what configuration is the audience and how do they view the stage? And this is really important, particularly for both of those spaces, because they're black box theaters where you can rearrange the seats fairly easily. The first, I'll show you a couple of shows, what I guess I would call the straight proscenium, where the seats are all at one end of the space and the audience is sort of looking down into what I guess you would say is a bit of a picture frame. I'm going to start with this show at the Firehouse. It's Arms and the Man, a comedy by George Bernard Shaw from the early 1900s. It has three acts. The first in a bedroom of a young lady, and a soldier comes in to disturb her during war as he's running from it. But I wanted to give a sense of the location and the outside world. So it's all very much a wooden platform. You can see the audience is sitting here at the end, but there are scenes, landscapes painted both on both sides and then upstage there. So you kind of get a sense of the locale. Let's take a look at another image. Here's the bedroom again. And because there's no wing space in the Firehouse and no chance to fly scenery to go from location to location, one of the things that we did was to redress the furniture, take a few things away, but these door units and the stairs, they all remain. This is the second act set out in the garden, and now you can really see these landscape paintings. And here's that ottoman again, and some flowers have been added. The table's been moved and redressed. And then for you can see some of the detail a little bit closer up. And I think you'll see as we go along here how important the right furniture and the right set dressing can be to define a space. And then in the third act, a fireplace, a stove was added, and a cabinet. Carpets were added. The ottoman is redressed once again. And this table is rearranged and the chairs are moved. Show at the Jesuit theater that was fairly similar is a comedy from the 1600s, She Stoops to Conquer, and 1700s, and the approach here was to actually create a picture frame, a proscenium arch, and then smaller arches inside. I was interested in the timbers that are found in a lot of those homes. But also bringing a little of the outside world in with these trees. But then these elements that hang on the side of the stage are pushed in for different configurations on the stage. So now you see a fireplace element. It actually had a 3D mantelpiece added for a little set dressing. Otherwise, everything was two-dimensional except the furniture. And you can see the stage floor here defined by these wooden planking. And here are these characters who are traveling and have gone to stopped at an inn, and so these panels have slid in, and you can see the different layers there as we proceed, and just how minimal scenery can define a place where you are. One of the final scenes was outside, and so all the scenery's changed now, and just the backdrop is lit. I love how the little windows glow. That's very funny. And at the end, everything is resolved in this comedy of manners, and you can see there's a bit of furniture, but it's definitely a sort of a wide open space. Again, that mixture of inside and out. Another seating arrangement that can be done is placing the audience on three sides, which definitely brings them closer to the stage and to the action. And I would start in the Firehouse with a Jesuit authored comedy called Rusticus Imperans. It's a bit of a Prince and the Pauper tale, and it started in the design here on stage with a funny little castle in front and bigger castle there. Is very much modeled after illuminated manuscripts of the time, and you can see how stylized the actors looked as they came on the stage. And this blacksmith gets very, very drunk. He's very abusive, and they basically dress him up and pretend that he's the king of the forest, of the kingdom, and he's a little confused. But we used puppets in this as well, which was interesting. Again, going after the illuminated manuscript of the medieval times. And here you can see the thrust. So the audience actually wrapped around on three sides here. And the castle spun round on a little turntable here. So what had been the outside of the castle now spins around, and there's a throne that sits there all the time for the king. In the Performing Arts Center, one of the thrust stages was created for a play called Squabbles at Chioggia, which is by Carlo Goldoni, who also wrote Servant of Two Masters, so we're talking the 1700s. And basically in this play, there are two families that are struggling here, and they argue and fuss and fight. And each family in a different house, and they go to the magistrate, and these walls would part in between the scene changes, and this wagon would roll down stage and bring with it scenery for the next scene, and you'd see the magistrate's home. I'll show you some images of that. But what I want you to notice here is how the audience wraps around on three sides. This is a picture taken from up in the balcony, but also sitting down below puts you right in the middle of the action. These two houses, one stage left and the other stage right. And because we were up at balcony level, you could kind of step on from left and right without building stairs up to them. You just kind of stepped into them. And as I say, this wagon would roll down stage, and the magistrate would try to settle the arguments between the two families. Or in the second act, did the same thing. So it wasn't in his office, now it was in his home. They had really invaded his space. Chandelier flew in, and basically the set was redressed. At the end, everything is fine and everybody's happy once again, and they all dance in the moonlight. And you can see again how the audience is deeply engaged in all of this, because they're so much part of the action with that seating arrangement. One variation on that kind of seating is a shorter thrust, where actually at the Performing Arts Center at the Jesuit Theater, all the seats spill down, but two small arms, if you will, reach around and give you a slight thrust. This is Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, which we decided to set in New Orleans during Mardi Gras right after the Second World War. The soldiers come back victorious, and everyone's so happy to see them. But of course, it's Shakespeare, and we have to have a little struggle here in this comedy. So these guys stir things up by, during this masquerade that they have, everybody's dressed up and mistaken identities, and supposedly the young lady who's supposed to be married has had a fling with somebody, but it's all false pretenses. But her father's very upset. They come up with a scheme, everything is resolved and fine, and at the end the wedding is taking place anyhow, and everybody's happy and dancing. But you kind of see how this space is transformed there. And really the set is built in at the same height as the balconies of the theater that are a part of that space. And the stairs just spill down, and oh, it's marvelous with all the greenery and the lights and the color. We also do shows completely in the round, where the audience is on four sides at the Firehouse. This was done by raising up the seating in a single row all the way around, and then actually getting a lot of dirt. It was a sort of soil mixture, I think like baseball, that you put on a baseball field. So it's kind of this sand and dirt. And this is a play called Light in the Village that's set in rural India, all about the power struggles as electricity is brought to this village. And so you can see how the scenery was meant to portray some of that rural life with branches hung. They get electricity and they all start watching television. It was really quite fascinating play. At the end, there's this sort of returning to nature and digging in the earth. And so the actors are actually able to dig in the dirt of the set. At the Jesuit Theater, we did a play by Tom Stoppard called Arcadia. And in this play, it's set in rural England, in one of those grand houses. People in the modern day are looking at the lives of people in the past who also lived in this house. And so there's this turntable that spins around with minimal furniture on it. And for the different scenes, the turntable would spin as the play progressed. And in all four corners of the stage space, you can see how there are the different seating platforms down below. This is again taken from up on the balcony, but you can see these background panels, and they show the landscape of the house around. And so by the end of the play, the modern people, contemporary people, mingle with the people of the past. And as I say, these background panels were in the four corners, and they go from a fairly realistic style to something much more abstract. As you move around the space, you can see how it was abstracted. One of the other considerations, particularly for the plays of Shakespeare, is to figure out, well, where are we going to place it? You have seen some productions with Shakespeare moved to different times. One of the first shows I did at the Firehouse was Twelfth Night, and his comedy involves twins who shipwreck on a coast, and they're separated. And a young lady dresses as a young man and goes off in search of her fortune, I guess, and comes to this town where a duke is trying to court a duchess. A duchess? I don't know. I'm not telling this story very well, but our approach was to set it around the turn of the century on a European boardwalk. And so we brought in all the sand and put it on the floor of the Firehouse. And the Duke Orsino has this gambling casino, the Casino Orsino. I don't know if you can see that. And then this becomes the Lady Olivia's home, her cabana. And so here's the Duke Orsino outside his casino there. And he has this live jazz ragtime band that performed, and it really, really worked very, very well. We could do these crazy comic bits with the clowns fishing there on the shore. And Malvolio, instead of, as it's written, as a boxwood scene where these other fellows are listening in on him and plotting, we did the old Victorian trick where you cut the eye holes in the newspapers. It was great fun. And he eventually gets locked up, and rather than putting him in a dungeon or a cell, we put him in one of those changing wagons that rolled down to the shore. This is Feste the Clown. And poor Malvolio. Another show that was brought into, I guess, the much more modern world was to do the play As You Like It, which we set in contemporary America, only rather stylized. So you can see there's a slight thrust set here, with the seating. And these small buildings that actually you could sit and climb on and perch on, and they were pushed around the stage to different configurations. And the Duke has taken over and exiled his brother, I believe, if I'm remembering this play. But there's this very tall facade, which I was trying to convey as a sort of a modern building. And you can see they all had cell phones, and yet using a little of a slightly older comedic style, since it is a comedy in the costumes there, in some of what we were doing. There's a big wrestling match, which takes place in the first act while they're there in the town. But then what happens is most of the rest of the play takes place in the forest. And so what happens is those big walls swing open and expose this structure of tree-like forms that had leaves on them. And there was a wagon that rolled down stage to give levels to climb on. But you can see how the one brother is left here in town for a time as it transitions into the forest. And then whilst his brother's there, having been exiled. And here's a little bit closer so you can kind of see how some of the levels we were able to play with this one big wagon that was kind of tucked inside with these walls closed in the first act. And then as the play progresses, these other arches swing open further and further to give more forest and allows for some trees to play with. Until at the very end, they're all opened up and everything is revealed. You can see how they opened them up at the end for this romantic finale, but you can see how these things pivoted open, these big arches to create an abstract forest. I also like the power of suggestion, particularly how a few elements can take you to a place. This was the last show that we did at the Firehouse. And again, it's a very small space, only had a 12-foot ceiling. It was about 30 feet wide and about 30 feet deep. Very small performance space. And this is Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. And so for the first act, there are these windows with drapes, bit of furniture, and a little bit of a wall unit. I'll show you here. This is set in London in his flat. And so there's a bit of a fireplace and a picture, the right bit of furniture to suggest where we are. But then this unit is actually triangular shaped. The Greeks would call it a periactoi. So the other two facades you can't really see, but they're in the back there. They slant in the back, but this whole thing pivots around. Little bit of sky cloth. And now those windows have moved, the drapes have gone away, and this little bit of wall unit has moved. So now we're out in the garden for the scene in the second act that takes place in the country estate, but outside. And then the third act is also at the country estate, but inside. And now the periactoi has spun one more time. The windows have moved, the walls have moved, and we just have a little bit of furniture here. Again, I really like the power of suggestion. It worked very, very well for the different acts. The first show then at the Jesuit Theater, when the building opened in 1999, 2000 it would have been, was Shakespeare's play Love's Labour's Lost, and we set that at the turn of the century. That is a comedy about a king and his the fellows in his court. They forswear the company of women until a princess shows up with her entourage. And so what you see here, actually, the only scenery is big sky cloth, bit of a ground row, so it looks like there's a landscape back there. And then these columns. And on one side here, you can see how they're spun to look like a house or a building. And over here, they're more like tree forms, but they would spin round. You can see the detail on them. They're just round columns that would turn, pivot on a big pipe that ran all the way up to the grid. So you could then have a forest outside where the princess waits, and this is all done with projection, just a big gobo there. Or here in the forest also, where a tent has been added, and the king and his entourage have shown up to court the ladies. At the very end, a soldier shows up and says, "Princess, you must come home. Your father has died." So it transitions right at the end from being this comedy to something a little more serious. And that's Shakespeare for you. I also like minimalism and metaphors. This is a play set in rural Ireland, Translations it's called. It's all about the Brits in, I guess I was going to say invading, but basically what they do is they map the countryside. This is Northwest Ireland in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And it's set in a barn uh, uh, where the locals are schooled. And so the set, as you can see, is a kind of a formal structure here of a barn with these columns. But what I was after was this kind of sense of entrapment with these timbers here. And the walls are a netting, a very rough net. So again, I'm trying to show that they're kind of trapped in this space. Um, this is where they learn their lessons, and they learn it all in Irish. And as the play progresses, the soldiers come, and one of the Brits falls in love with an Irish girl, but he can't speak to her as in love with her as he is, but he's caught by one of the locals. And the Brits arrive and say, "If we don't find our soldier, we're going to burn your town to the ground." So you can see how now in the second act, it's cold and rainy, and everybody's really quite scared after the heat of the earlier summer. There actually was live grass downstage for that scene where the young lady encounters the soldier outside, isolated in the light. And what are they going to do now? They're just not sure. And then the Brits say, "Well, we're going to burn the town." And so the tail end of the show, this flame red light shone on the actors as they looked off into the distance. Very dramatic. I also like to paint scenery with light. This is Ballad of the Sad Cafe. Oh, forgot to put the title up there. Which is set during the Depression in a southern town. And it has a kind of indoor-outdoor feeling, mostly set in a store. And the townspeople come, they're a little frightened and confused by what's going on. And you can see how the different lighting effects would change the environment and the time of day, and how being able to move up and down these different levels with stairs and what have you allowed for the many different scenes of the play. And we could show the conflict between characters with the dramatic lighting, how this red light shines on the stage, and how these two characters are in conflict and they fight here. The set, we deliberately left space between the wood so that when it was backlit, you'd get these different effects with the lighting. Really was very dramatic. But you can see the different looks that were possible there with light. Finally, I would say it's really important to pay attention to the details. If you get the details right, you don't need all that scenery. Like here, this is one of the fellows in the court there in the first act of Love's Labor's Lost, and you can see how he's one of the chemists, and he has all these strange things on one of the rolling work tables there. Or here, in Squabbles at Chioggia, all the detail of the things on his desk, his parchments and books and his wig and his candle. Again, you don't need a lot of scenery if you get the details right. Or here, in translations, notice all the set dressing that was there that the audience could see, the straw and the barrels and baskets and ropes and what have you, even a picture of the missing mama who never appears in the show, but you think she might be around somewhere. Yeah, that's plenty. Thanks for listening.